HR 1 stands up against lobbyists and dark money. And I would reckon to think that this is probably just as much a part of Joe Manchin's calculus as anything else. Because when it comes to this bipartisan argument, I got to tell you, I don't buy it.
What I love seeing is progressive lawmakers who have finally gotten comfortable enough to speak out against members of their own party, including conservative members of their own party, like Senator Joe Manchin, who has served as an obstacle in passing incredibly important legislation, including robust election reform, Joe Biden's infrastructure bill, and the American Families Plan. Now, of course, he doesn't want to do away with the Senate filibuster, which requires 60 senators to vote in favor of any piece of legislation in order for it to pass. And so AOC is essentially calling Manchin out for his nonsense, hollow argument about how he's just doing this because he wants unity in the government. He wants bipartisanship. Well, AOC isn't buying it. Take a look.
Joe Manchin has voted for bills that have not been bipartisan before. Look at the American Rescue Plan. So this is not just about bipartisanship. This is, I think, because you look at the Koch brothers and you look at, organizations like the Heritage Foundation and conservative lobby groups that are doing a victory lap, claiming victory over the fact that Manchin refuses to change on the filibuster. And I think that these two things are very closely intertwined. And I think that there's a desire to make this just about protecting the franchise, but protecting our democracy is also about making sure that we give lobbyists and dark money groups, which are funding these attacks on the right to vote, the boot. But, corporate money has a very, very tight grip on both parties. And I think that has to do with the calculus in this situation that people aren't really discussing enough.
All right, so let's decode that a little bit, because what she's specifically referring to is Manchin's refusal to co-sponsor the For the People Act. That's the election reform bill that's already passed in the House, and now unfortunately it's stalled in the Senate as a result of the legislative filibuster and the refusal of Senator Joe Manchin to co-sponsor. In fact, he's the only Democratic lawmaker in the Senate who has refused to co-sponsor it, and he argues that the reason why he doesn't want to support that particular bill is because it's a bill that seems to be far too partisan in favor of the Democrats, when in reality, the only thing that this bill does, and it's important, is reform our elections to ensure that all eligible voters are able to access their right to vote without all of these obstacles that are being put in place intentionally by various states like Georgia and Texas and Florida. The other thing is, and this is the important part that AOC is specifically touching on, it reforms the elections by getting money out of politics and ensuring that we do something about dark money, ensuring that there's more transparency in the system and we know exactly who's funding what. As Jane Mayer recently reported in The New Yorker, these Koch-backed organizations are already lobbying heavily with Republican lawmakers in the Senate in order to defeat this bill. And Manchin is saying that, the reason why he's against the bill is because it's not bipartisan enough. And so he put forward his own version of an election reform bill that is far more narrow and certainly does nothing about money in politics, does nothing about ensuring that there's transparency in regard to dark money. And it's because he has the same corporate interests. The same reporting from Jane Mayer indicated that these Koch-backed organizations have been in talks with Joe Manchin as well. So I love the fact that we have progressive members in Congress now feeling confident enough to speak out and call this situation what it is. This is about corruption. It's not about bipartisanship. In fact, if you take a look at polling out of West Virginia on this very issue, you'll see that the majority of West Virginians, including Republican voters, are in favor of the For the People Act, specifically because it does away with money in politics. So just to give you some of these details, polls found that 79% of West Virginia voters support the For the People Act, 76% of Republicans and 79% of independents or unaffiliated voters in the state support the For the People Act. So it's important to know just how popular that legislation is, because really the desire to get money out of politics is a bipartisan issue. Both Democratic and Republican voters certainly do want to do away with that corruption. Now, AOC isn't the only progressive who's speaking out against Joe Manchin. I do want to tell you about an upcoming event that you can take part in if you happen to be in West Virginia. So the Poor People's Campaign is planning to hold a Moral Monday demonstration in West Virginia. Of course, this is Manchin's home state. And as Reverend Dr. William Barber writes on Twitter, the Poor People's Campaign is announcing today that on Monday, June 14th, we will hold a moral march on Manchin in West Virginia, led by West Virginians of all colors, creeds, etc., from the hood to the hollers. In fact, he's essentially telling Joe Manchin, I'm coming to your house. And he also says in a recent interview, it's time to march on his office. It's time for people of all differences to stand together against him. We call it from the hollers in the mountains to the hood. So please look into the details of this event and attend if you're in West Virginia. Obviously, there's power in numbers, and we certainly want to do what we can to hold Manchin accountable for his lack of action. Now, Manchin's substitute for the For the People Act is known as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. As Huffington Post reports, Manchin wants Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, another Democratic measure that is backed by Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska. That legislation, named after the late civil rights legend and Representative John Lewis from Georgia, is more narrowly tailored. And I explained a little bit of how it's narrowly tailored. It certainly does away with the provisions that would tackle money in politics and corruption in our political system. Now, remember, Manchin says, I want to put forward a substitute bill because I want bipartisanship. I want to work with these Republicans. They want to work with us. I just know it. I know it. But do they? Here's Mitch McConnell in a very recent press conference saying otherwise.
Well, as the majority leader said, the voting rights bill is intact. The law extends well into the future. What this rewrite of it does is grant to the Justice Department almost total ability to determine the voting systems of every state in America, which they're trying to do directly through H.R. 1. They would try to achieve indirectly through this rewrite of the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court did not strike down the Voting Rights Act. It's still the law. What they struck down was the pre-clearance part of it that applied only to the southern part of the United States, because the Supreme Court concluded the conditions that existed in 1965 no longer existed. So there's no threat to the voting rights law. It's against the law to discriminate in voting on the basis of race already, and so I think it's unnecessary.
Now, it's obviously very possible for the Supreme Court to, misread the current political climate in the country and the fact that the conditions actually haven't really changed that much in regard to various red states wanting to make it far more difficult for certain voters to go to the polls. As we know through legislation that was just passed in the state of Georgia, which limits ballot boxes, for instance, in urban parts of the state while expanding ballot boxes in rural parts of the state. Gee, I wonder which voters that impacts. And of course, the areas that are impacted the most in terms of limiting accessibility to voting happen to be predominantly African-American parts of the state. So obviously Mitch McConnell is lying, but that's not any type of surprise if you've watched this show and we've provided evidence of how often he lies on a regular basis. But I do also want to just push back against this notion that what the Supreme Court did through their ruling in 2013 did not repeal the Voting Rights Act. But here's the truth. It repealed the most important part of the Voting Rights Act. And that most important part ensured that if states like Georgia want to restrict voting or suppress the vote for certain demographics, well, they would need to go to the federal government and basically get permission before they change the law in that regard to ensure that racist election laws aren't being passed in these various states. Clearly, repealing that was incredibly disastrous. That's what paved the way for Georgia to be able to do what it did in signing their recent election laws. And so it is important to pass legislation. But my point here isn't, hey, let's try to just concede to whatever Manchin wants. No, Manchin's narrow bill wasn't even really a concession to Republicans because Republicans don't even want it. They don't want to reform the elections. They might cry about elections. They might claim that voter fraud is an issue or a problem. But when it comes to actual robust legislation through the For the People Act, which of course includes election security as well, they vote against it. They vote against Manchin's slimmer version of it. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about bipartisanship. This isn't about trying to play nice with Republicans in the hopes that these lawmakers can work together. This is about Manchin, as AOC said, protecting his own corporate interests and protecting the fact that he gets dark money himself and he doesn't want that process to stop. He loves that corruption, he wants to keep it in place. And so don't let him lie to you or to the American people overall about what actually drives and motivates his decisions here.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.